In the winter of 1942, the northern waters seemed especially grim. A gray veil of fog lay over the waves, hiding the horizon and turning every sound into a hollow echo. In this cold silence, among waves and drifting ice, life continued for people whose names rarely appeared in the war reports. One of these men was Arkady Lazarev, a fisherman from a small settlement on the Barents Sea coast. His wooden trawler, old but sturdy, had once carried cod and herring, and now served for supply runs transporting fish, soldiers, or crates of food to coastal outposts. Arkady was a man of few words. He was in his early 40s, his face roughened by wind and salt, his hands scarred by nets and ropes. He was accustomed to the sea, to its cold breath and unpredictable temper. The war had not changed his attitude toward work. One had to keep going to survive. He was not a soldier, but he often saw traces of the conflict. Silhouettes of ships appeared on the horizon, and distant explosions reminded him that even the sea had become a battlefield. That February morning he set out early. A light snow settled on the deck, the fog thick as cloth. The radio remained silent, and only the quiet hum of the engine disturbed the stillness. These waters were rarely visited by others. German submarines, the feared U-boats, patrolled the northern routes, hunting convoys, and every local fisherman knew of their presence. Arkady accepted it as another fact of life. He avoided talk about the war, knowing danger could come from anywhere. When the sun rose faintly through the mist, he noticed an odd shape in the distance. The sea was calm, but amid the gray expanse, something metallic jutted out. Taking his binoculars, Arkady saw, about 500 meters away, a section of metal protruding from the water, resembling the stern of a vessel. He thought it might be wreckage from a recent battle. Such finds were not uncommon. The sea often delivered its grim cargo: planks, barrels, lifeboats, sometimes bodies. He steered closer. Soon the outline became clear. It was a submarine. The bow was already submerged, the stern twisted upward, scarred and blackened. Faded markings showed a cross and worn letters, German. The vessel had clearly gone down recently. Around it floated debris, wooden boards, torn fabric, pieces of equipment. Arkady slowed his engine, scanning the wreck carefully. A thought crossed his mind. Could anyone have survived? He knew that German sailors in these waters were the enemy. Yet the sea seldom divided men into foes and allies, especially when survival was at stake. He circled the wreck cautiously. Then he noticed movement, a flicker of arms near the edge of the hull. He turned his boat and approached. There were several men clinging to the structure, their uniforms dark and soaked, their faces pale as wax. One lifted his head weakly, attempting to call out, but the wind swallowed the sound. Arkady hesitated. If he brought these men back to port, he would face interrogation, maybe suspicion. The war left little room for compassion toward the enemy, yet leaving them to die was unthinkable. At sea, tradition demanded that every life be given a chance. He grabbed a rope, tied it to a hook, and tossed it toward them. One man caught it, and Arkady began hauling him in. The others followed slowly. Within minutes, 4 men lay on the deck of his small trawler. They could hardly move, trembling from cold and exhaustion. Arkady covered them with canvas and gave them water. No words were exchanged. There was no need for them. The meaning of the situation was plain enough. Then he turned the vessel toward shore, keeping the radio off to avoid drawing attention. The journey back took nearly 2 hours. All that time, Arkady kept his eyes on the horizon. Perhaps these men had sunk Soviet ships the day before. Perhaps they had taken many lives. Yet now they were only castaways, stripped of power and weaponry. He felt a strange calm, as if performing a duty not to the war, but to life itself. When the outline of the village appeared through the fog, his decision was already made. He would hand them over to the border guards. By evening, the pier had filled with curious locals. No one expected Arkady to return, not with fish, but with captured sailors. Soldiers from the nearest post arrived quickly, securing the area. The Germans sat motionless on the deck, staring blankly into the distance. Their faces showed no fear, only disbelief, as if they could not comprehend how a lone fisherman in a weathered wooden boat had pulled them from the same sea that had just destroyed their submarine. From that moment, Arkady Lazarev's story ceased to be just another episode of a fisherman's life. It became the beginning of an event discussed by both officers and villagers alike. No one yet knew that the rescued men were members of a submarine crew on a special mission and that Arkady had, by chance and conscience, stepped into a story that would become a symbol of human resilience and the strange contradictions of war. By the following morning, word of the capture had spread through the entire coastal region. Fishermen, guards, and even officers from the nearby naval outpost came to the small pier where Arkady's trawler lay moored. The air was cold and sharp, the wind carrying the smell of fuel and salt. The 4 Germans, wrapped in military blankets, sat silently under watch. Their faces were still pale, their eyes distant, as if the events of the night had not yet settled in their minds. Soviet officers conducted the first inspection with precision. They noted the serial markings on the pieces of wreckage and the fragments retrieved from the water. The wreck was identified as a Type 7 U-boat, one of the standard German submarines that had haunted Allied convoys for years. The discovery was significant. It was rare for such submarines to be caught so close to the coast. The officers concluded that the vessel must have been damaged by depth charges from a patrol ship and forced to surface before sinking. Arkady stood aside, answering questions from the investigators. He described how he had found the wreck and rescued the survivors. He did not embellish or dramatize anything. The officers wrote down his account, impressed by his calmness. One of them later noted that the fisherman's behavior reflected the old maritime code, the unwritten rule that one never abandons another sailor to the sea, regardless of uniform or language. By noon, a military truck arrived to transport the prisoners to a camp inland. They walked with difficulty, still weak from exposure. Before leaving, one of the guards showed Arkady a damp notebook recovered from the submarine's remains. It contained coordinates, codes, and route sketches. The discovery suggested that the U-boat had been operating on a special reconnaissance mission, possibly tracking Arctic convoys. The information was immediately classified. That evening, when the harbor finally quieted, Arkady sat by his trawler, watching the horizon darken. The day had left him uneasy. He had never considered himself a participant in war, yet somehow the sea had made him one. Around him, the other fishermen spoke in low tones. Some saw him as a hero, others with suspicion, whispering that it was risky to get involved with enemy sailors. But Arkady remained silent. To him, the event was over. He had done what he thought was right. Over the next few days, military divers explored the site of the sunken submarine. They recovered documents, weapons, and a damaged periscope lens that confirmed the boat's identity. It was U-302, reported missing weeks earlier after an attack on a northern convoy. The discovery provided valuable evidence of German patrol patterns in the region. For naval intelligence, the incident was a stroke of luck. Meanwhile, Arkady's life gradually returned to routine. He repaired his nets, checked the engine, and prepared for another trip. Yet something in his daily rhythm had changed. The sea no longer felt the same. Each time he set out, he found himself glancing toward the horizon, half expecting to see another dark shape rising from beneath the waves. The war had drawn closer, no longer distant. The authorities later commended Arkady for his actions, though modestly, through a short note from the regional command. It praised his vigilance and courage, but made no mention of his name in public. Wartime secrecy demanded restraint. For him, recognition mattered little. He remained focused on his work, the only life he knew. A few months later, the incident with the submarine was formally reported to Moscow. Analysts confirmed that the captured officers had been gathering information about Soviet shipping routes and Arctic bases, Their testimony, combined with the materials recovered from the wreck, helped identify several other U-boats operating in northern waters. In a quiet, indirect way, the fisherman's decision had contributed to larger events, though he would never fully realize it. The Germans, according to military reports, expressed disbelief during interrogation. They struggled to accept that a civilian fishing boat had been their rescuer and captor. For men trained in naval warfare, the thought that their mission had ended, not in combat, but in the hands of a lone fisherman, seemed almost absurd. Some officers in the naval staff later joked that the sea itself had sided with the fishermen that day. As spring approached and the ice began to break along the coastline, the memory of that February morning slowly faded from daily conversation. Yet among those who served on the northern frontier, Arcadie's name lingered as a quiet legend, a reminder of how the vast sea could turn an ordinary man into an accidental participant in history. By summer of 1942, the war in the North had intensified. The Arctic convoys were growing larger, carrying essential supplies through dangerous waters. Every voyage was a battle against both nature and enemy submarines. Reports of U-boats sinking merchant ships reached the coastal villages almost weekly. Fishermen learned to recognize the sound of distant explosions and the eerie silence that followed. Arcadie continued his work with quiet persistence. His trawler, patched and weathered, became a familiar sight along the coast. To outsiders, he was an ordinary man earning his living at sea, but among locals, he had gained a quiet respect. People called him the one who caught the Germans, though he never used that title himself. He disliked attention and avoided speaking about the day he found the submarine. For him, it remained a simple act pulling drowning men from the water. Despite his reserve, the incident had changed him. He began to notice small details he had once ignored: floating oil traces on the surface, fragments of wood, the dull thud of distant depth charges. The sea had become heavier, burdened with the remains of ships and men. Sometimes, in the gray twilight, Arcadie thought he saw shapes moving beneath the surface, as if the wrecks themselves were restless. He did not share these thoughts, knowing that the sea had its own ghosts. In late June, Arcadie was summoned by naval authorities to the regional command post. The officers there questioned him again about the U-boat and the circumstances of the rescue. They seemed less interested in the story itself than in small details: the direction of the current, the time of discovery, and the markings on the wreck. Arcadie answered carefully, realizing the military wanted to confirm intelligence from other sources. After the meeting, an officer told him that several more German submarines had been detected in the same area, possibly searching for their lost comrades. The thought unsettled him. The sea, once his refuge, was now a silent front line. He imagined invisible shapes lurking beneath his boat, unseen but near. That summer, he began to sail less often and kept closer to the shore. Yet the work remained necessary. People still needed fish, and the small settlements depended on the catch. Duty and fear existed side by side. One evening, while returning from a short trip, Arcadie saw something strange on the horizon: a thin column of smoke rising from the sea. At first, he thought it was a storm cloud, but as he approached, the shape grew darker and sharper. When the sun dipped low, he realized it was a burning vessel. Through binoculars, he saw debris and oil spreading across the surface. The ship was gone, swallowed by the water. Only floating wreckage remained. There were no survivors. He reported the incident to the local naval outpost. Later, he learned that it had been a small patrol craft sunk by a torpedo. The enemy was closer than anyone had believed. That night, Arcadie sat in silence by the pier, listening to the wind and waves. The same waters that had once given him life now felt unpredictable, almost alive, a shifting, dangerous force that could erase anyone without a trace. As weeks passed, more patrols appeared along the coast. Military command ordered all fishermen to carry identification and report unusual sightings. Arcadie complied, though the new restrictions made each journey heavier with tension. The sea. open and free, had turned into a guarded border. By early autumn, rumors reached the village that the Germans had intensified their submarine operations. People whispered that they sought revenge for the captured crew. Some believed another U-boat had been spotted near the old wreck site. The rumors spread quickly, adding a quiet dread to the evenings. Arkady dismissed gossip but checked his boat's engine and nets more often than usual. Deep down, he sensed the sea was preparing to test him again. On a misty morning in late September, while sailing toward his usual fishing grounds, he noticed the waves behaving oddly. The surface seemed disturbed, as if something large moved below. He slowed the engine and waited, scanning the water. The fog thickened, the air heavy with salt. For a long moment, there was nothing, only silence. Then, far in the distance, he heard a hollow metallic sound, faint but distinct, like steel scraping against steel. It faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only the endless gray expanse. Arkady steered back to shore before noon, uneasy but outwardly calm. He told no one about the sound. Yet from that day forward, he avoided the area where he had once found the submarine. The sea, he realized, never forgets what it holds. Beneath its surface lay countless stories, some unfinished, waiting for those who dared to listen. Winter returned early in 1943. The northern coast froze once more under the weight of wind and ice. The war pressed on, and the sea, restless and gray, seemed to echo its endless rhythm. Convoys passed further north now, heavily guarded by destroyers. For Arkady Lazarev, life had settled into a quiet routine again, fishing when possible, repairing his trawler, and keeping close to the shore. Yet a feeling of unease stayed with him, as if the sea itself remembered his earlier encounter. The months since the submarine rescue had changed the region. Naval patrols increased, and every fishing vessel was checked and registered. Locals learned to live under constant observation. Yet even under the strict rules, people depended on the sea for survival. Arkady continued to sail, though he moved carefully, studying the waves before each trip. He no longer trusted the calm experience had taught him that silence on the sea could mean danger. In late January, during one of his regular fishing runs, Arkady noticed unusual debris floating near the channel. Wooden planks, torn ropes, and pieces of metal drifted toward the shore. The smell of oil hung in the air. It was clear that another vessel had been lost, likely during a night raid. The wreckage stirred old memories. He marked the location and reported it to the nearest post, then went back to his routine. But that night, while lying awake in his cabin, he felt certain that something larger was happening beyond the horizon. Days later, confirmation arrived. The Navy reported that another German submarine had been destroyed nearby by depth charges from Allied aircraft. According to intercepted radio signals, the vessel had been searching for information about its missing comrades. The thought chilled Arkady, perhaps the same U-boat group connected to the men he had rescued a year earlier. The war, it seemed, had come full circle. A few weeks later, a storm swept across the coast. Winds tore through the village, waves breaking high over the pier. Arkady's trawler strained against its mooring ropes, but held firm. When the weather finally cleared, the shoreline was littered with debris, nets, barrels, fragments of ships. Among them, Arkady found a small metal plaque, corroded but legible, bearing the faint marking U-302. It was the same submarine he had once encountered. The sea had returned its memory. He brought the plaque to the local command, where officers confirmed its authenticity. It was likely torn free when the wreck shifted during the storm. The discovery made the old story resurface among the soldiers. They spoke quietly of fate and coincidence, how the same sea that had spared the German sailors had now erased their trace completely. Arkady listened without comment. For him, the meaning was simpler. The sea keeps what it wants and gives back only fragments. Through the remaining months of the war, Arkady continued his work, though less frequently. He grew older, slower, more cautious. Each trip felt heavier, as if the sea demanded a kind of respect he could never fully repay. Sometimes he thought of the 4 men he had pulled from the freezing water where they were now. Whether they survived captivity, whether they ever thought of the fisherman who had saved them, he would never know. The war scattered people too widely for answers. When victory finally came in 1945, the celebrations in the northern settlements were quiet. Too many names were missing, too many families waiting for those who would not return. Arcady marked the day by taking his trawler out into the open sea. He dropped his nets, as he always did, though he caught little. It was not about the fish. It was about standing again where life and death had once crossed paths. He stayed there until dusk, watching the light fade across the water. Years later, locals would still tell the story of the fisherman who captured a German submarine crew without firing a shot. For many, it was a legend of courage and chance. For Arcady, it had never been about glory or victory. It was about the sea, vast, merciless, and indifferent, where all men are equal before its power. In the end, that was the truth the war had taught him, that even in the age of submarines and bombers, the greatest force was still the sea itself, remembering everything and forgetting nothing.